Okay, welcome everyone to another IAA Virtual Talk. I'm Miles Calvert, Director of the IAA, and we are joined this evening by current artist in residence Lili Chin as part of our new media residency programming. Lili Chin is an artist based in New York City who combines video, installation, nature, architecture, and rituals of time within her work. She has exhibited internationally and nationally in locations such as the Edinburgh Film Festival, the Anthology Film Archives, and the Eli Center of Contemporary Art. She has attended residencies at the MacDowell and Visual Arts Workshop, Visual Studies Workshop, just to name a few. Her MFA was received from the University of California, San Diego, and BFA from the Pratt Institute. Please use the chat feature for any questions you have during the talk, and we'll definitely address them closer to the end. Lily, it's been a pleasure having you in the IEA for the first half of your residency period, and we're eager to hear more about your research and what you've been working on while you've been in the IEA. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Miles. I am excited to be here. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I have been doing a lot of work with your help and Briggs' help and getting to know all sorts of machines. I think I wanted to start this talk by just introducing some of my work. I'll give some context for the bulk of it. I'll be talking about 3 to 4 projects. But then I'll also be going into a kind of open session for conversation about what I'm working on here. I won't have any images other than a background to look at while we have that chat. So I'll get started. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And then here we go. Right, so I wanted to begin with a work that I made in 2024 at Microscope Gallery. This was a show called Historia's Garden, and the show comprised of several elements. The main feature was a 3-channel video installation that involved sculptural elements suspended before or in front of the screen and obstructing the light to cast some shadows. These forms were both fossilized as well as like fossilized shapes that you could see illuminated by the projections, as well as casting shadows. And the way that the projection was set up was that you could actually walk closer towards the shadows and the projected forms, and you would be able to see your own silhouette with it, like inside of the projection. The moving image comprised of 3 images of Super 8 films that were shot across the world, ranging from Okinawa to New York City to Wyoming to Australia. And the show was really to kind of explore a global garden. I kind of would say that my work lies at the intersection of film, video, sculpture, and installation. And I make my way through these diverse mediums to engage with aspects of indexical, mark-making, and mimetic thinking across lines of raw materials and how they inform me as an artist. I situate myself between the psychological states of the moving image and time and the phenomenological experience of the physical world to engage in inquiry into the natural world that stems from a place of curiosity and wonder. Memory and sight informs my practice, and it often stimulates a new body of work. I see my engagement of working across many materials as a way to create an ecology around a subject. In this case, the subject was Historia's Garden, thinking about a global garden, but also the word Historia is associated with history, identified with Renaissance ideals of painting and kind of a sort of panoramic painting that would engage and sway and persuade the viewer to feel emotionally involved, regardless of whether you were learned or not learned. So that was the impetus for creating this panoramic large-scale installation. Also in the show were these ceramic pieces. For a while, I've been working on what I call these puzzle works. They are floating ceramic slabs that float off of the wall and that are kind of separated and come back together, kind of like a floating puzzle. I often collect botanical elements from site-related places, in this case, my garden, And in this case, I was working with copper oxide, and the next one is cobalt oxide. And thinking about glazes and its sort of raw materials as a way to kind of like create impressions, a sort of frottage of forms. I'm also interested in, I work with a variety of media, so I hope you're not going to be surprised when you see a proliferation of various materials in my work. There's always consistencies because the way that I think about the materials have to do with the way in which the raw materials engage with the natural world or engage with time to affect an experiential encounter with the materials. And a lot of it comes from my foundational line of doing my undergrad both in film and sculpture. So celluloid and photochemical processes are quite a through line of how I think about like chemistry and materials. In this case, I was working with uh, one fresco, which is a type of lime plaster treatment in which the lime plaster is open and you have a finite window to apply pigment. And as the pigment is overlaid, the raw pigment is overlaid into the lime plaster, it will cure, and over time the color begins to bloom. And I sort of relate that to a kind of photochemical process that I'm familiar with in terms of like exposure in photography. These frescoes are drawn from scientific imagery. Oftentimes, I'm influenced, and I also kind of connect with scientific images and scientific data, as well as work with scientists to kind of explore different subjects and themes. In this case, I was looking at sedimentary cores, and these are microscopic images of sedimentary cores from the International Oceanographic Discovery Program in Texas. A few years ago, I was in a dune shack in Provincetown, and I had no running water and no electricity, purely off grid, um, living with like oil candles or oil lamps at night. Really, really spare experience in the dunes in a very isolated way with a 20-minute walk to any kind of source of civilization. While there, I was really open to the forces and the elements, and I created these tabletop sculptures that were using harvested materials from the local surroundings and also drawings and watercolors that were inspired by maps of the Skowhegan National Marine Sanctuary, which is a marine sanctuary that's close to the tip of Cape Cod. And I was really thinking also about wind and weather and thinking about lightness of material and paper in relation to the elements and the forces of the elements that were very strong in the dunes. Last year, I created a work called, actually, this was from, I believe, 2024. Time is a little bit awkward since the pandemic, so time just kind of compressed a little. But this is a show at Diverse Works in Houston, Texas, and this is called Cetacean Blue. It's a two-channel video projection that involves 16 millimeter film that was shot around the coastline of the Northeast, particularly surrounding coastal lines around Maine and Providence and parts of Connecticut and New York City, and even Cape Cod, and thinking about marine life that is affected by the rising temperatures in the oceans, and also thinking about sound pollution that was occurring in the sea. So with sonar mapping and coming up in 2030, there is an endeavor to map the entire seafloor of the planet, and they use sonar mapping to try to capture as much information as possible to understand the movement of the depths of the seafloor, but they're also, these sounds are also affecting the navigational track of some of these marine mammals, which is difficult for them. This is projected onto a sail, a fisherman's sail that was formerly used by my friend's father. And the sounds that I'm not playing are sounds of the cetaceans and sounds of marine life underwater with underwater sounds. Continuing on, last year I was along the coastline of of Montauk, and I was looking a lot at shells and also coastal erosion in Montauk, Long Island, New York, and really kind of observing the forms and getting inspired by the forms and using fresco in a three-dimensional way. This time I was using Savon Noir to apply to the fresco, creating a waxy finish that then would make the frescoes waterproof and creating then this kind of velvety finish. So here are some abstract works that were made. This one's inspired by a moon shell. And I'd say that the continuation of working with fresco is a way to really think about like also lime and its relationship with calcium carbonate. And I'll be expanding on this a little bit more when we get to the works that I did in 2023 for a show called Foundations. Calcium carbonate is kind of like a lot of the fossils and a lot of the shells that we encounter are comprised of calcium carbonate. So it seemed to make a lot of sense to be working with fresco. I think also what I really enjoy about fresco is that it's a very enduring kind of material. The color doesn't fade because the color is not applied, it's enmeshed and it becomes bonded with the actual form or with the actual material that it's applied onto. So I'm going to jump backwards in time to 2023. This is a show that I did in Galveston, Texas, where I lived for a year. It was the first time I was in Texas, and Galveston is a little island an hour south of Houston. It's very isolated. Islands are kind of dear to me. I grew up, part of my high school years were spent in Singapore, which is an island nation state in Southeast Asia. And I currently live on the island of Manhattan. And I grew up in Oregon, which is along the coastline. So water is very, very important to me. Moving to Galveston was a very new experience. It was my first time in Texas. But more importantly, it actually reminded me of Singapore, but the area was very humid and hot, and the land was extremely flat. It was so flat that it was kind of boring to me. I coming from New York and coming from the topography, this extreme like geological topography that we have with the ice sheet and all these glacial striations and remnants of glaciers and rocks and boulders. There was none of that in Texas, or in particular Galveston. It was very flat. And as a result, I decided to look under the sea and look under the Gulf of Mexico. And I realized that there was so much to understand and to really unpack, because that is where the spring of oil came from. And, all these fossils existed, and the fossils would then eventually become fossil fuels and oil. At the time, I was looking again at a lot of scientific diagrams of the Gulf of Mexico, both present and modern day, and looking back to geological time. So what you see on the wall are a series of frescoes that were inset into the wall. I'll give you some detail images. And then on the left wall that you see with the projection next to it is a series of anthotypes, as well as a fresco in the middle and ceramics. And then to the left, you have a 16 millimeter film. As you can see, I work with a lot of different media and material. An anthotype is a way to get an image that's kind of similar to a photogram, but instead I was using natural dyes. So this is coming from the mulberry tree just outside of the art center where I was spending a lot of time at. And the color that you see of the dark is actually was the color of the mulberry, and then the light would just bleach out the rest of the paper. And on the ceramics, you have these imagined impressions of topographical aerial views of the rivers and of the bodies of water around the Gulf of Mexico. And on the left, there is a film, and I'll show you a little bit more information about the film as we progress in the images. Here's some details of the fresco that was like sitting in the wall. And this is looking at the Cretaceous seafloor, I think from 30 million years ago. So really the geological history of the Gulf of Mexico is much younger than like parts of North America in the northern region. And scientific diagrams were interesting because I'm sort of also thinking about like technology, especially through cameras, and how technology has been kind of an aid for scientific instruments as well as medical instruments, and using that as a reverse way to look at that and then kind of translate that into fresco. And this is using a sgraffito technique, which is kind of like etching into copper. Um, Next up, I'll show you a little excerpt of the film. So this is the 16 mm film that was projected on that wall. This was hand processed black and white film that was color and processed into black and white. And this was actually processed with water that was contaminated along the Houston ship channel. And I found it really interesting that a bird sanctuary was right next to this contaminated body of water. So I filmed the bird sanctuary, and then I dipped it and immersed it in the Houston ship channel water for an evening, and then I processed the film, sort of thinking about these kind of processes in which how does the toxicity of what a material is exposed to yield a artistic form? What does it undergo, and how does that get revealed through its state of my manipulation? See, okay. And this is a close-up of the anthotype. As you can see, the dark area was the original mulberry emulsion, and then the brown is just simply what was bleached out. Here is another corner view of that wall, and another sgraffito with a kind of gradient background. Here you can see how the fresco has been inset into the wall, and I really wanted it to be flush against the wall rather than emerging out, to kind of really think about like different textural surfaces even on the wall as you're having a direct encounter with a surface. So we kind of like cut into the wall and set the frescoes into the wall. These are two weavings, and these weavings were actually they contain 16 mm film as well as 120 mm film sitting inside the weavings, and the yarn comes from Scotland, and these are loosely inspired by the standing stones at Macri Moor. Before I left for Galveston, I had spent some time in Scotland, and I was really kind of interested and enamored by these standing stones that you often see in areas of the British Isles as well as Scotland. And I think both like I think of like the lines of weaving and this sort of rhythmic pattern making as a way to think about like sedimentation, and also thinking about like accumulation. And in this case, I'm also thinking about verticality as regards to the standing stones. Here are some details of what you saw on the wall. So fresco inset with oyster shell, and below a lot of sand kind of came up in Galveston because it's an island. So here's sand with these lime tiles with rocks and other objects that are set onto the table. And then on the other side of the wall is this installation that has an entranceway that I cut through with a skill saw, just to kind of like break into the wall and into the and create an entrance into the interior room. And inside the room, there are a variety of objects. I'll show you some details shortly, but they range from ceramics to aluminum casts to fresco to some copper on the floor. And then at the end is a 16 mm film called "This Is Not the Gulf," that was inspired by a kind of ritual process of visiting the sea every day, the Gulf of Mexico every day for a finite period. And I chose a period of Lent because that was kind of a finite period of like 40 days. And it was also kind of a homage to an earlier project that I made called "This Is Not the Sun," where I practiced a Zen practice called Kinhin, of walking back and forth down a long aisle and taking a photograph during the integers of time that I was doing this kind of routine walking and back and forth. In this case, I was walking to the coastline every day. This is a little bit closer of a view inside of the foundations room. And on the left, you can see some plumb bobs that are suspended and hovering over these kind of conical ceramic I believe these are salt-fired vessels. This is some detail images. I'm not going to show a moving image of some of the wildlife around the Gulf of Mexico. I really loved these brown pelicans. They're my favorite bird. They're kind of goofy, but they really are very graceful when they fly in formation together. Here are some other images from the film. And then this is a reverse view, looking backwards. As Brig knows, I like to work with overhead projectors. There's this aspect of like casting light directly that's just the simplicity of like light going through a lens that I think is really direct and tactile. There's an aspect of like thinking about tactility and light that I'm also very interested in, and tactility in general, hapticity in my work. So you can see that what's being projected is just really sand from the beach in Galveston, as it's also illuminating the plumb bobs on the right wall. Here's a close-up of that. Here are some of the plumb bobs. A few more. Thinking about weights, and I was also thinking about like measuring before, if you were to measure the seafloor before you use sonar, you would literally use something similar to a plumb bob and throw it in and try to see how wet that line would be to determine how deep your water is at whatever part of the ocean you were in. Here are some more frescoes. These are inspired by like washover fans. So these have to do with coastal erosion as well. And here are some details of what was on the floor: ceramics, aluminum casting, fresco, more ceramics. And then this is also ceramics. And this, I think this will play a little bit into like thinking about like printmaking a little bit, because the way that I made these was I would put these, I would create these beds of sand, and then I would kind of like draw with my finger into the sand, and then I would put slip clay into the sand, and I would remove it, and the sand would stay onto the forms, and I glaze them. I really love these works that I made. So here's another. And then I'll just talk about two more bodies of work. This is Alter. This was in a show at Island Gallery in New York City in 2023. This is watercolor onto silk, and some objects that are on the table comprised of rocks, frankincense, and ceramics, kind of inspired by phenomena that seems almost, I would say, impossible. I sometimes I'm interested in mythologies, and I'm also interested in aspects of like even biblical stories. In this case, is sort of like the idea of like what, like the parting of a Red Sea, like how does that even happen? But just sort of thinking about like, okay, like these stories that are are they myths? Are they real? Like if they are, how does that even work? From a scientific standpoint. Just sort of thinking about that from like a place of curiosity and wonder, and just interpreting that. So this is a detail. And I really like watercolor onto silk because of the sort of like bleed that you get. And I think Miles knows a little bit about that bleed because we've been experimenting with that this morning. And here are some details. Some of the rocks are actually from a place called Ein Gedi, which is a desert in an area of Israel. These are frescoes that were also in the show. So again, during that period when I was in Galveston, these frescoes were also inspired by aerial views of Galveston and Bolivar that were actually affected. Galveston is a really interesting place. It's if you've not been there, I do recommend it. It's a place that has a lot of cruise ships, but it's also got a lot of scientists. And it's also unfortunately known to be one of the it's known to be a site of one of the greatest disasters, natural disasters in the 20th century. In 1900, a large hurricane passed through, a big storm passed through Galveston, and NOAA didn't exist at the time. There was no weather prediction on a sort of like even a local scale. And there were many people at the beach when this hurricane came through. So thousands of people died. And because Galveston is along the Gulf of Mexico, it's really kind of it's like a hot spot for all these hurricanes. It's really quite something, because when you go there, everybody knows about how to live with a flood and how to live life where your life just disappears and you just figure out how to move on and reconstruct. And maybe that sort of plays into some of the subject that I'm dealing with right now. But I think I wanted to highlight the fresco on the far right, which is Cesium 137. The frescoes on the far left are kind of like looking at coastal erosion and also aerial views of like even Galveston after a hurricane. But on the right is Cesium 137, and Cesium 137 is from a microscopic slide of an isotope that is associated with radiation and with uranium, and it's really associated with when the geologist looks at a sediment core and they see Cesium 137, they can identify that is from the 20th century, the Anthropocene, because before that there was no uranium, there was no trace of uranium that mankind had ever been able to create through fission before 1945. And that will play into some of the things that I'm looking at right now today at my time at IEA. And here's a close-up of kind of interpretation of Galveston with wax. And then the last work that I'm going to show you is from my show in Japan, in Akiyoshidai, near Yamaguchi. I was here for about a month, and I made a site-specific installation comprising of weavings and ceramics, unfired ceramics, monitors that had live CCTVs, and this place. I was interested in learning that so Japan is like a big island. And often I think when people think about Japan, they think of coastlines, they think of water, but I was in the rural mountains. It was really interesting to learn that this whole area in the rural mountains was actually underwater. And it has a very extensively large cave and a lot of limestone caves and a limestone plateau. So geology really became kind of like a big interest of mine while I was there. And I was filming the caves, and I was creating these weavings that were inspired by the palette of the winter that I was around, and also thinking also about like geology as well, like thinking about like striations and geological time. And I created also like these large scale projections and these large natural forms with watercolor that had these kind of accordion-like expansion shapes that would kind of like expand and create volumes and then flatten with watercolor. And this is called 350 million years in the blink of an eye. And it was inspired by a local elderly man that I had a long conversation with, who was talking to me about how a lot of areas in rural Japan are really they're losing their population because of population decline and people not wanting to move to the rural areas. So there's this kind of aspect of isolation and emptiness that's happening as nature begins to kind of like take over and reclaim the area. And so he used this phrase, 350 million years in the blink of an eye, and I thought that was very poetic. So here are some details. And just to kind of give you an idea of the interactive part of this, you can see the scale, but if you look in the foreground, there is a television monitor, and the television monitor has a live feed. And so if you look kind of far back, you'll see that there's a little mountain on the table. It's made of clay, and that's facing that little mountain in the back. So if you're looking at it in detail, your image will be actually projected and thrown on the front screen. So here is image of looking at it, and you can see the CCTV, and then you can see how it's throwing the image in the front. This is really kind of also meant to be interactive and sort of spatially activated the more people are entering and engaging in the space. And I guess like you can see that in this installation, as well as my other installations, I'm working with a plethora of media, really to kind of circumnavigate a subject or a theme that is kind of enriching in my mind. And I'm not particularly like, what do you say? Like I'm not monogamous towards a single material. I'm monogamous to the subject, I guess, if you will. So yeah, here are a few more images, and the video projections that you would see are time lapse of the trees and of the rocks that you'd see in the surrounding region. And there was also bamboo. I thought that was the last one, but I have just this one that I think also is kind of valuable to think about, because this is two-part installation that I did called The Variables of Silver, Night and Day. This is night. I don't have a large image of this, but this was done when I was at the Visual Studies workshop at Rochester. And I was really looking at like aspects of silver and silver halide release when you're doing it like a photochemical bath, and creating an installation using light and reflective surfaces. And then variables of silver day are a series of photograms, as well as phytographic images and salt prints that are installed together with driftwood that are collected along the Genesee River. And the Genesee River, people aren't familiar. Kodak is really kind of was one of the largest companies, or the largest company, aside from maybe Xerox, that was the economic engine for Rochester for a very long time. And as we all know, Kodak is really was one of the primary distributors for celluloid film and for moving pictures and motion picture cinema. But what we very rarely get to hear about is that as you are processing celluloid, you release silver into the water, right? And so when you release silver into the water, you have to send it to, you have to send it to be hazardous waste to be reclaimed. And, you can actually reclaim the silver because the silver is kind of expensive at this point. But getting back to the Genesee River, there was a lot of silver that actually like leached into the Genesee River and contaminated the river to the point where people were unable to actually enjoy the river. So all these different kind of non-camera driven processes were really ways to kind of get into the insides of understanding contamination and understanding ways of actually kind of using light to get a direct contact and a direct kind of substance of what the interaction between light and an emulsive surface would be like without a camera, and to kind of also use that sort of expression of manipulation onto surfaces to kind of think about potential toxicity. So here's a detail. Yeah, and I think that's enough work that I guess I'd like to show you. And then I'm just gonna play this little video that is just some stuff that I've been capturing over time, and we can have a short conversation. How does that sound to you, Miles?
It sounds perfect. Can you tell us a tiny little bit about this video? And then I have a starting point question for you.
Yeah, so the video that you see is I've been doing a lot of microscopic imaging while here, of everything from like inks and dyes to particles that are associated with like raw materials that we use for like glazes and for ceramics. I haven't gotten to the cellular part, but I will be like also putting like botanical elements under the scope as well. And I'm kind of also, so some of the, like a general topic that I've been exploring, that I've been taking under my wing, is the topic of nuclear energy and nuclear technology. And it really came from being in Santa Fe and New Mexico last November, being in unbelievable close proximity to Los Alamos, going on a hike with a really nice docent who happened to have had a job at Los Alamos, and just beginning to try to understand proximity to a facility that created the atomic bomb and trying to unravel that in a more personal way rather than try to think about it in a historical way. I mean, both I think are interesting to me, but so coming here, I wanted to put different liquids and different chemicals and different particles under a microscope to think about like ways of capturing fluid dynamics to explore ideas of like explosions in different slow motion or contact with different fluid states that create patterns that may resemble like slow motion or like what an explosion would look like, feel like, sound like, and maybe even taste like. So I don't know if that is kind of that yeah, that sort of answers your question. Yeah.
I haven't even asked one yet, but you actually responded to it and answered it. But it was the first thing I wrote down was like, what was your turning point? Because I'm looking at your earlier work and it feels natural ecologies, wax frescoes, Zen, and then we're pivoting to like nuclear radioactivity and Geiger counters and and really, really harsh materials. And I think the first film that you showed that was part of the bigger installation with the frescoes mounted into the wall. That was the first point where you mentioned the word toxicity. And I'm like, well, was that the first turning point for being interested in kind of the dark side of chemistry? If and there's probably a better word for that.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of throwing out things now. Like, what was that turning point? Because it kind of feels like these different things that happen on different continents um, that happen over time all result in a big reset. And it seems like there's a start over, or, and you're gravitating towards that. And when did that start happening for you?
Um, I think a lot of the reset happened in 2020.
Right. Fair enough.
Sorry, I didn't even realize I was making that connection. However, people want to make the 2020 connection. But the reset began like internally with my body. And that was a time when I decided to change. I mean, this takes a personal direction, but I think a lot about connections between the body and what the body undergoes versus, versus a material and how a
Mhm.
creator manipulates a material and puts it like, I don't know, you put it in kiln and it's like, in a kiln for like 8 hours and it just becomes hardened or something, or like what if you put a laser on it and it cuts through? What do you put in a chemical bath? And for me, the body and the vulnerability of the body is a very somatic kind of like reference point that I think all of us inhabit it on a visceral and direct level. So it's for me, it's a very intuitive, logical state. Um, but it began with a sort of direction of like really kind of pivoting to thinking about using food as medicine rather than pharmaceutical medicine as medicine. And just sort of also thinking about like um, kind of toxicity within the body and what it means to kind of like try to use nature to heal ailments. And that just was happening sort of externally outside of me working with these materials. And so I think subconsciously it began to inform the way in which I'm like, trying to unravel the discrepancy between like an exposure to toxicity and what it means to kind of like move through that and maybe in aspects heal or like to kind of recover and regain. I guess from a physical standpoint, I would use the word homeostasis, but like regain a sense of like holistic center,
Mhm.
um, or even lament over like some kind of loss due to like toxic experiences. And I think that maybe gives me a way to sort of think about like the natural world around me and even animals and their exposure to toxicity and I think that also like I think a lot about sustainability in my practice and like kind of in some degree like the impact that I have. I think also with this work that I'm doing in particular, it's kind of like interesting where I'm kind of going into exaggerated states. Like I'm looking at using the camera through for scientific imaging, like microscope, to go from something very small to something very spectacularly big. Or like, as I'm kind of like thinking also about like nuclear energy and like man's imposition to create like nuclear fission and what that means for like the future of mankind or even for that moment in like the middle of the 20th century. and what that is against like radioactivity from like, from the sun or radiation on a cosmic or galactic level. So thinking about like the micro and the macro too. I don't know if that, yeah.
It's it's hurting my brain on so many levels and in the best possible way because I'm thinking about your earlier work where it's scientific, it's analytical, and it's meant to be explored and navigated. If you're working on something right now, like in the IEA, are you are you considering this is all hypothetical, but I think it's still important, like not display purposes, but you're making things that are um of a certain scale with these ideas that are so grand. So like plate tectonics and glacial, I don't know, glacial movement over time and atomic bomb, but then the things you're making you can hold in your hands. Why
Yeah.
make it so small?
I think it comes down to wanting to think about like different scale shifts, right?
Yeah.
Like, um, when I mean, I don't know what the final outcome of all this research is going to be, but I'm working with things that are very molecularly small, but also domestically small. I mean, I think that scale, when brought to the human physical level, it gives me a way in which I don't know, there's like a level of compassion or empathy that starts to
Mm.
kind of um, implicate me. And I just say this because I'm not going to get super deep here, but I've been listening a little bit to Hannah Arendt, and she talks about the banality of evil. Um, and it's kind of like she's a philosopher that was a student of Martin Heidegger, and this goes back to like her struggling of like World War II and the Nazis and the Eichmann trials, and finally Eichmann is on trial in Israel and for the atrocities due to the war. And Eichmann was the individual that actually like facilitated going to the concentration camps and like you know just really operatively made everything happen on that level for the Nazis and the concentration camps and the deaths of so many Jewish people. Um, but when he was put on trial, it was baffling that he was like a normal person, nothing monstrous, just very like you and me. And it's sort of like incomprehensible. I know I just kind of opened a kind of like can of worms here, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, this sort of like wrestling of like something that feels very familiar or sort of recognizable, I think happens on a kind of one-on-one level, like in like a level of like a human to human contact, right? So it's like kind of, I don't know, maybe on surface value, when you make that contact, you think of that as, for me, I think of it through the lens of empathy and exchange and maybe even from a place of love or something. And then you just kind of like can't comprehend the devastation behind this that you might encounter. So I think that there's something kind of palpable when you make something that is like so out of reach into like a more domestic and calculated scale on a human level, not to just amplify something that's already completely out of reach.
And I guess you're semi-restricted by materials and mediums that you choose. So, like for example, do you mind talking about some of the materials that you've been using in the past week and a half within the IEA at the university?
So many. Um, okay, I'll just talk about what I've been doing. I'll talk about four things. So on the electronic level, I was really gravitating to the Sandine. And the Sandine is a kind of I'd say a video synthesizer that was made in the 70s by Daniel Sandin. And it's interesting because I had done a residency in 2004, and they had like a machine that Namjoon Pike kind of had adapted, I believe, by putting a magnet onto a CRT monitor. And so this Sandine uses a kind of technology that manipulates the sound waves directed through the CRT monitor and a magnet. And so depending on how you turn the knobs and the dials and the switches, you can get different frequencies and different kinds of textures and patterns. Um, And I think like what attracted me, there were other video synthesizers that are more modern, but I think I was particularly attracted to this, I think because of the look. But as I did more research, I realized that like CRT monitors actually like microphones, microwaves that emit radiation. Um, and there's this also connection with like magnets, I think that like I was kind of like really interested in, and also radio waves and thinking about like the spectrum of wavelengths beyond what we can see visually that can impact like experiences sonically as well as like beyond our visual spectrum, infrared as well, and heat, you know. And these are all lending themselves to conversations around the physical impact of what it might be like to have like exposure to radiation in a bomb. And it's very, very dark for me to kind of go there. I don't know that I can handle it for too long, but I'm just, I think I'm trying to understand viscerally like what what flesh and what a body might undergo under those under those circumstances. Not to be morbid, but just to really understand on a more somatic level. Like, you know, we can talk about all the atrocities and stuff, but just on a somatic level, like cellular degradation, like what are all these things that are happening in like the blink of a second? What if we expanded that time and slowed it down to try to understand that a little bit more? So I'm also working with like laser cutting and thinking about like laser as a like a light source that's really burning through. I'm working with acid baths and etching to think about like acid and you know, acid and with a metal that then kind of like loses some of its metal because of the acid bath. I'm also looking at dye sublimation and putting a material under extreme heat, but also going from gas to solid to gas to solid, thinking about vapor exposure. So all these material states that I'm exploring are kind of echoing forces and energies that like that maybe remind me of this kind of exposure through the processes to heat and to light um, and to chemicals.
It's just
Yeah.
ways of thinking of the materials that we have access to in the daily through the amazing facilities that it makes me think of them in a completely different way, which is really refreshing. So it's nice seeing it through your eyes. It's been so much fun having the banter with you over the past few days about what you're trying to do and us trying to figure out what you're trying to want to do to help you the best way while you're here. And it's making way more sense the more time we spend together. And I think today there was some really fun breakthroughs as well. And I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. I think I know what the game plan kind of is. But that could change tomorrow, and we'll find out tomorrow, right? I think this is a really exciting part of like a residency in general.
Well, I have to say thank you so much, Miles, because this has been so open for me. Like you've
Great.
been very open and
Good.
you've been embracing the directions that I want to go. And I'm like, am I am I just wanting to do too much? And then I like, you know, but as we're talking about it and as you've been open to even having conversations, I'm like we're processing things in real time. And
Yeah,
you know, I think that I also got to like an interest. I mean, I've been thinking about like aspects of printing onto metal for a while already before I got here and even thinking about the copper etching, but like I think I started thinking more about it like when you were talking about like also like salt copper etching and just some things that were coming up that like started to kind of really kind of fast track some of the things that had already been percolating before I even got here
right.
and creating again like as I talked about like using different materials but thinking about them in a space of an ecology and this is sort of what's happening here. It's like a kind of laboratory of like an ecology that like different materials that are interconnected to kind of like pursue the exploration of a kind of overarching theme or subject.
And isn't that the whole point of universities and educational establishments, right? Being able to dip into different silos of information, even if they shouldn't be in a silo in the first place. But
I
this,
love that you said that because I think that universities we've come very far from where they should be. And I won't unpack the conversation around universities now, but I think that when they are a really great asset, like they are now, they open a space for just constant learning
right,
and learning never stops. I mean, when I say that I make from a place of curiosity and wonder, that's really a place that like constantly um, propels the stimulation to want to make without necessarily getting the total answer. It's not like it's arriving at a certain point. The process is always a big part of it. And it's also so rewarding for me to collaborate with people or to interact with technical experts, with scientists, to have these conversations.
Mhm.
And it becomes a much broader world beyond um, the finite place of making. Like, and it's so much more fun than just having your work in a gallery. You know, like I'm not
Well,
saying
yeah.
having your work in a gallery isn't great, but there's this kind of like research with other researchers. And I sort of think about like a kind of like hive. And I also think about the time when there weren't silos. You know, a lot of the thinkers that I really respect didn't see these disciplines as separate. Like, you know, I mean, even Da Vinci was like, you know, he was into engineering and mathematics and art and science. It was all kind of, it was all holistic. It was all integrated.
You can't just live in your entire head by yourself and be productive or prolific or anything. You need to have these social interactions.
Yeah.
Are you okay to take a question slash comment from the chat?
Yeah, for sure.
Do we need to understand to create art? Hiroshima, Mon Amour, protagonists, were they trying to think of politics or nuclear technology?
You know, it's been really hard unpacking this because it's actually quite live. I mean, it's just happening right now. You know, like the whole conversation around nuclear is happening right now. And it's hard for me not to think about like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Bikini Atoll. I mean, that's all part of my research. Um, Sometimes I feel like when I get too invested in that, it becomes an obstacle to go with the materials because the materials themselves and the way that they're interacting or exposed to a certain kind of energy is going to release a certain kind of conversation that will get me closer to what I'm trying to express, talking about or bringing up the subject of nuclear. Um, so on one hand, it is a bit of a critique, but I don't think that that's that interesting because everybody's critical about nuclear energy, or most people are. You know, I feel like I think also some of the starting point for the interest was just trying to also understand what it means to be on the precipice of something, to try to encounter something where you're on the precipice of greatness, but you also have a bit of a moral dilemma of whether you should go there. And when I say greatness, it's subjective, but what I mean by that is like it's opening Pandora's box, right? So
Right.
there is a pivotal like seismic moment, as you can see with cesium-137, that determines that we just entered like, you know, the Anthropocene. There's no natural creation of like nuclear uranium fission in life's history until this one point that humans did that. So it is a turn, geological turn. There's a mark there, and how it's shaping our futures even today. You know, is inescapable. Um, and I am critical about it. And then but I don't. It sometimes it feels so large for me that I feel like it could conquer me, and I'm trying to like scale back. So sometimes when I get overwhelmed, I sort of scale back and try to tunnel through by looking at the materials themselves, and that gives me a little bit more freedom. I don't know if that
It's
answers your
it's
question.
heavy and it's all involved and it can bog you down. So
Mhm.
may I end on a light question for you?
Yeah.
What are you most excited about doing in the studio tomorrow?
Copper etching. I'm going to be playing with acid.
Ooh.
I don't like to play with acid, but I have some people helping me and watching, making sure that I'll be fine. Controlled situation and filming it. So yeah, I'm excited to see this process occur. It's sort of yeah, it's exciting. It's a little perverse. I feel weird about it, but I'm also interested in kind of seeing the results. So
Right.
yeah.
Well then, I think we're there. Um, Lily, thank you for your time this evening, and thank you to everyone listening and attending. We need to thank Alfred University and the School of Art and Design, and of course the Shine Joseph Endowment for their continued support of IAA programming. Check out our YouTube page for additional artist talks, and of course our website for available IEA editions and blog posts about all of our previous residents, including our incoming cohort for the 2026-2027 season. Lily, thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in the morning.
See you in the morning. Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Good morning. Bye.